The Boston area's biotechnology sector has become a hotspot for promising work on a vaccine for the coronavirus. But the frontrunner in the race for a vaccine, Moderna, has also come under criticism with questions raised about everything from the racial composition of clinical trials to pricing and disclosures about scientific information. Among those raising questions at a recent protest outside the company's headquarters is our guest from Science for the People and Free the Vaccine Boston. He's also a Broad Fellow at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. We'd like to welcome Brian Cleary. Thank you very much for being with us, Brian.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Brian, many people call you a doctor because you have a PhD. When people hear about development of a vaccine, they might be wondering, what does a PhD have to do with the science around a new vaccine? At least speaking about what's going on at the Broad Institute, how would you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fundamental science that goes into developing a vaccine. So some of that's being done at the Broad Institute and indeed all over the world. It relates to understanding the viral genome, the proteins that are produced by the virus, and how we can get our own immune system to target those proteins. That's generally how these vaccines work. And in fact, of course, all scientific endeavors build on over a century of scientific discoveries. So, it's kind of inspiring to see the whole world come together, researchers to collaborate and combine their knowledge to address this pandemic. So some of that's happening at the Broad Institute, and of course we have many biopharma companies in the area that are addressing this as well, both through their existing technology and through kind of public-private partnerships or through government investing.
Well, there are a lot of decisions about these boundaries between public and private, what has to be shared, what gets to be kept. But many viewers here and on the planet really want to know, when is it going to happen? How much is it going to cost when I go to get vaccinated? We heard some encouraging words about that, but you also have some doubts about them.
Yeah, it's not really clear. So there's actually about 170 vaccines in development globally. And these have to go through clinical trials to establish safety and efficacy. And there's only about 10 that have advanced to phase 3 trials. One of the leading candidates is being developed by Moderna. Others are being developed by AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson. Several of these companies have actually committed to pricing their vaccine at no cost. Others, like Moderna, have stated, in fact, they fully intend to make a profit off of this. So they'll charge as much as $37 a dose, with each individual needing multiple doses. And unfortunately, it looks like you might need to get sort of booster shots along the way. The cost could, in fact, even though this is a little bit lower than some of the sticker shock prices that we're used to seeing for cancer treatments and other pharmaceutical products, the cost is nonetheless going to be prohibitive for many people around the globe. And not only is that sort of undermining the equity that we would like to see in any sort of solution of getting us out of this pandemic, it's also undermining how we'd like to address it epidemiologically, right? This is a pandemic that spreads. This is a virus that spreads among people. And so if you only vaccinate a small portion of the population that can afford the vaccine, you're kind of undermining your efforts to stop the spread of the vaccine just by reducing the set of people who can actually pay to get those doses. So again, I mean, I think both in terms of equity and in just scientifically in terms of the epidemiology, these kind of profiteering level prices don't make any sense.
Well, you're talking globally just now. And so I guess what I'm gathering is that even if everybody in America got a vaccine and didn't have to pay anything out of pocket for it, at least, there could still be problems with other people around the world not being able to get this. I mean, could that actually come back to harm us here in some way at some point?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the problem. Again, not only there's the concern that you're going to leave entire countries and continents behind. Obviously, that's something that we want to avoid, but also that if you continue to have outbreaks in other parts of the world, that could undermine our own efforts here in the United States. But even here in the United States, there have been some agreements, for example, with Moderna, where the government is has an agreement to buy doses from Moderna if indeed the vaccine turns out to be effective. We still don't know if it will be effective. If it turns out to be effective, the government will buy those doses at profit-making prices from Moderna, but then give those doses away to Americans. But that's only going to cover a portion of Americans who can get their vaccine through the government. It's not quite clear who that's going to cover. There might be many people living in this country who won't get vaccinated through the US government, maybe uninsured people, maybe undocumented people who clearly, we would like those people to be have the vaccine available to them as well. Again, both for humanitarian purposes and for purposes of just stopping the vaccine in its tracks.
Well, a free vaccine can cost a lot of money, and I think already the federal government has put in upwards of maybe $900 million to back the research here. What do you see happening next if you look down the road?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple agreements that I mentioned in place. You're right that the US government has paid Moderna at least over $955 million to develop this vaccine. They negotiated with Moderna to pay $1.5 billion to buy 100 million doses of the vaccine if it proves effective. And they have the option to buy another 400 million doses. So, the good news is that we do have multiple candidate vaccines being developed in parallel. We still don't know how it's going to unfold, though. There are concerns that any vaccine is ultimately going to be effective on its own without taking other measures because, we're starting to see more reports of people around the world getting reinfected. Thankfully, there are still relatively few of those, but it could be kind of like, seasonal flu or the cold, where you in fact have immunity that wanes somewhat quickly, meaning you would have to continue getting boosters for a long period of time, or the vaccine would have kind of low efficacy from the starting point. We don't really know, but I think that's part of the problem here is that there's still a lot of uncertainty. And in the meantime, some of these companies are already starting to cash in off of taxpayer dollars.
Now, there's also some private investment going on, and Moderna has released enough information about its research so far to, I think, benefit from that. On the other hand, doesn't that private investment help by speeding things up too?
Yeah, certainly private investing. And, Moderna had some existing technology, some of which was built with government money and some of which was built with private investing. And it's definitely the case that the technology they've built with their private money can be leveraged together with new information that were sort of public discoveries to end up benefiting everyone. I think the question here is we have to determine our priorities. And the priorities could be, helping everyone equitably, rapidly get out of this pandemic, or they could be kind of lining shareholders' pockets with profits. So the question is, if we kind of force vaccines to be priced at cost, is that going to somehow undermine the system? And I think we've already paid to develop this vaccine. So there's no argument saying that, forcing this to be priced at cost is going to eliminate the innovation or something like that. We already paid to have it innovated. So as I said, I mean, there is private investment that we're leveraging here, and I think that could be a good thing. But I don't think that we're necessarily going to undermine the entire system. That's a common argument that's made by defenders of high drug pricing in general, is that you'll lose the innovation in the system if you force equitability, basically.
Well, looking down the line, a vaccine for the coronavirus could be needed for all we know, several years. And there comes a point where you have to decide when this should go generic. What about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about patents, right? Is it sometimes takes 20 years. I mean, that's the common lifetime of a patent. So if we allow for things to be priced exclusively and controlled exclusively by a patent-backed monopoly, then it might not go generic for 20 years and prices will be dictated by a single company. We know from the history of past campaigns that eliminating this sort of exclusionary licensing of technology and patent monopolies can positively impact millions of lives. This has been seen in a number of different cases, perhaps most dramatically and tragically in the HIV/AIDS crisis. So when the first drugs came out for HIV/AIDS, they were the most expensive drugs in history. They were exclusively licensed and backed by patent, monopolies. And they were helpful, but they were not available to most people on Earth. The vast majority of people on Earth with HIV were not able to get these treatments. Then eventually, due to the efforts of activists, Yale had one of the new promising treatments exclusively licensed with Bristol Myers. Activists forced Yale and BMS to release that monopoly and allow for generic production. That generic production resulted in a 30 to 50-fold decrease in price very quickly, making this drug affordable and available to millions of people around the globe who previously couldn't access it. So there is precedent here that these sorts of campaigns to reduce prices, to allow for generic production, they don't collapse the ecosystem of drug production. The concrete thing that they have succeeded in doing is, as I said, massively increasing accessibility and positively impacting millions of lives.
What about the information from the research and how it's shared? And this could be a decision up to the company or even the government. If you have too much information, that can be harmful in one way. If you have too little that's being shared, it could cost lives. What should be different from what you see right now?
Well, I think that there's a couple concerns. One is information as is necessary for generic production. We just addressed that in terms of the technology and how to manufacture it, the vaccine. But there's also an issue of trust. So, we mentioned that there are clinical trials going on right now. I think it's really important that all of the results of the clinical trials are available for kind of worldwide scrutiny, so everyone can really understand how this is effective and how much it's effective, how many doses might be needed. Another thing that I think is important for transparency's sake is to understand how much these companies are actually getting from the government. In the case of Moderna, there's been more and more stories trickling out where it turns out they've received tens of millions of dollars in funding from the government that they're failing to disclose on their patent applications. So we actually don't even understand the full scope of how much government investment is going on here. And indeed, it seems to be so significant that now the NIH is claiming intellectual property rights to Moderna's vaccine. So, you're right that I don't think they need to release the results of every single experiment that they run in the development of the vaccine. That's not going to be helpful. But the sort of summary results that are helpful, that are needed for scrutinizing the effectiveness and safety and that enable, robust generic manufacturing of the vaccine, I think those need to be globally openly available.
Thank you very much for taking the time to walk us through that.
Thank you for having me, and pleasure to be here.
Yep, thank you. Brian Cleary from the Broad Institute. And we'll have more news in just a moment.